everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you, as I always do, from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly. And today I've got a really terrific and interesting guest. This gentleman has been deep diving into some serious questions about authoritarianism, its origins, and its durability. He's written a ton of books on the subject, including his most recent with Stephen Levitsky, entitled Revolution and Dictatorship, the Violent Origins of Durable Authoritarianism. He's a big-time brainiac. He received his BA from Harvard College, which is in the news today, and his master's and PhD from my alma mater, that's UC Berkeley. He's been published all over the place in the New York Times, the American Journal of Political Science, Foreign Affairs, and frankly, more publications than I have time to mention. He's won a whole slew of prizes and academic chairs. He's on Royal Societies. He's got fellowships. But most importantly, he's with me today to break down our own perilous political moment. So with our very own democracy hanging by threads, welcome, Lucan Way. How are you?
Good. Nice to be on here.
Might as well start with what's in the news in your alma mater, which is Harvard. There's been an assault, as you very well know, on our academic institutions. And today there was maybe a glimmer of hope. There was a court decision that I guess might put the brakes on this effort to get foreign students out of Harvard.
I think in general, I think in terms of the courts have been, almost universally rejecting his various efforts. I think if I'm not mistaken, it's like 97%. Some insane number. And what's interesting about the court response is that even though historically the courts have been highly partisan, if people are old enough to remember the 2000 election when the Supreme Court went, straight partisan divide on the election between Gore and Bush. But both Democrats and Republicans have been rejecting Trump's various measures. There's a small difference, but it's really not much, which suggests the kind of courts have become remarkably bipartisan. So I think that is definitely overall good news. I guess the question is will the court decisions matter for Trump? Because courts don't have an army.
They don't have even the marshals.
They can't go in and force them to do stuff. So I think that's a big question mark.
Well, as we're talking about authoritarianism, or we're starting to talk about it, and very often when you have these coups, the ultimate power tends to come down to the barracks. What are the colonels and the majors and the generals going to do in support or not against the ruler? One thing we've seen here is he's cleaned out the chiefs of staff and the highest ranking officers. My guess is so that he will have compliant barracks if he needs them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important question. I think we just don't know. Historically, the military in the United States has been, I would say, stunningly nonpartisan to a kind of very strong degree. That's one of been kind of the major kind of core sources of democratic durability in the United States. But you're absolutely right that he has been attacking that and trying to politicize the military through sort of quote unquote attacks on wokeism and the like that have been used to sort of as a way of kind of ensuring that loyalists are in positions of authority in the military. So that is very much a danger. I agree.
I saw this op-ed, actually it was a video op-ed with three Yale professors who, are relocating above the Mason-Dixon line to the 51st state up there in Canada. And I say that jokingly, the Mason-Dixon line. But, for the first time in my life, because I've been a comedian, I felt like there's actual risk to do even what I'm doing right now. It is not beyond the pale of my own imagination for there to be a knock on my door and say, guess what? Congratulations, you just won an all-expense-paid one-way ticket to El Salvador. I've never felt that before, but I do feel it now.
Absolutely. No, suddenly things that 6 months ago we would have thought would be completely unimaginable are now, not necessarily likely, but definitely, within the realm of possibility. There are a number of other examples, third term, things that I would have just dismissed out of hand that I think aren't necessarily kind of likely outcomes, but definitely cannot be discounted in the way they could have been before.
So you've done a deep study of sort of comparative tyrannies across the 20th century. And to what extent does what we're seeing here match, the the playbook that you've written about elsewhere?
So my book, Revolution and Dictatorship, which Stephen Levitsky and I finished in 2022, covers some of the most sort of classic revolutionary dictatorships: the Soviet Union, China, Cuba. And these are dictatorships that, I mean, most authoritarian regimes come to power and they just want to stay in power and earn money and get by, and are therefore willing to make all sorts of compromises with whomever is in power as long as the dictator gets to stay in power and they get rich. But these are very different dictatorships. You have people like Lenin, Mao, Khomeini, who basically are deeply driven by ideology and take enormous risks by basically challenging everything and everybody, challenging core interests, eliminating private property. Khomeini declared war in 1979 on all the Persian Gulf monarchies and military dictatorships, such that everybody sort of attacks them. So these are like very risk acceptant, as they say in political science, dictators, which is very different. But so the short term, they suffer they suffer enormous risk. They could be overthrown, but they've survived this period. Then it's sort of a situation of, if what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so these dictatorships tend to be very robust. And so you've had like the Soviet Union, which lasted 74 years, Mexico, 84 years, and China, which is still going strong. So the question is sort of, what does this have to do with the United States?
Right.
Right. I think for the most part, it's very different. If anything, the sort of authoritarian regime that's emerging in the United States is relatively weak. At the same time, I think, there are kind of revolutionary elements to what's going on. I think, we see kind of in Project 2025 a real break from past, for conservatism of recent past, which has been focused mostly on sort of tax cuts and, maintains the same international policy, tariffs. I think really what's going on right now is that they are kind of basically, in a lot of ways, taking their cues from Mao. Right, they are engaging in a kind of cultural revolution to destroy universities. I mean, Maoist cultural revolution in the 1960s was really targeted at the universities. It was professors like me who were vilified and attacked, and there it was quite violent. It's not yet, you don't see any kind of levels of violence, but you certainly see a wholesale effort, which is really unprecedented, to simply destroy the university as such, which feels sort of has a kind of totalitarian tinge to it. And that's the only way to put it.
Well, of course, I went to Berkeley, as you did, for graduate school, which was a center of protest. And there was a Republican governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, who, looked at the university as really maybe his arch enemy, defunded it and did everything he could to just discourage protest. One of the things as I look at this is I often ask myself, what is the perfect world that those folks on the other side are imagining? And as I think about it, it's a pre-Brown v. Board world. It's a Jim Crow kind of segregated, hierarchical, racially tiered society that seems to trigger their nostalgia. And that's sort of, what I feel, that all this so-called social progress that started there and goes through the 60s, that's really the focus of this assault.
Oh, very much so. No, it's a world that I'm not sure ever really existed, but it's certainly in their imaginings. And I think that, certainly, in a sense, they are right that, I think in most places, universities are an important source of democratic dissent, which is why they're so important to a democracy. I think, in many authoritarian regimes, South Africa to Chile and whatever, in South Korea, universities have been a major source of democracy and democratization. So in a sense, they're right from their point of view to target universities. I don't think it's crazy, from the point of view, I think it's awful, but it's not irrational in the way that, for example, tariffs are simply irrational. This is, going after the university, makes a lot of sense in terms of what they're trying to achieve.
My father's had a bunch of surgeries. His life's been, on the precipice. And every time, the doctors that surround him isn't Dr. O'Reilly and Dr. Schwartz. It's the doctor from Iran, the doctor from China. It's the nurses from the Philippines. It's basically the United Nations, the smartest people converging to save my father's life. And I live here in Hollywood. If I go down the street, I got Thai Town, incredible cuisine. I got Koreatown, I got little Tokyo. I mean, I live in this multicultural paradise, a lot of which is about cuisine. And I don't really want to go back to just Denny's and those kind of restaurants and that kind of world.
I mean, I think that's right. I think, it's certainly up here in Canada, we have a very similar thing. I mean, Toronto is a incredibly multicultural place, which is really wonderful. But I do think that for a large section of the population, I think who have just very different attitude towards multiculturalism. I think what they see is kind of rightly, or, there's surely an element of truth in terms of, threats from China towards their jobs. And, it's just not totally irrational. But I think definitely sort of this, research has shown that this sort of fear of multiculturalism in terms has been the most direct source of a lot of support for populism and people like Trump, is this fear of diversity, that sort of these people will, unseat the power of white Christians in society. And that's really, again, like research, going back the last decade has really showed that that's by far the most powerful factor, shaping support for these guys.
Well, I could remember very clearly when Ronald Reagan was in Berlin and, looked to the east and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And now we've got 47 with 34. I'm talking about the felon in chief, otherwise known as PVP, Putin's vice president. And he's insisting on completing this wall. And my question to myself is, if that wall ever gets done, how am I going to get out?
You're always welcome up here.
Oh, good to know. Well, Canada's always been a nice safety valve for, dissidents in the United States. Here's a question I have for you. I'm old enough to remember Nixon, and I was in high school, and his corruption, it was different. It was like all the cards were sort of face down. It's like, what? Watergate? He did that? Oh my God! It was like all a surprise. In the case of the current residents, his corruption is completely transparent for anybody that's looking. It's the most honest form of corruption. I mean, just with the Bitcoin, I mean, these pardons just in the last 24 hours, it's completely transparent. So ultimately, it's really not about him. It's about us. This was all there to see. It was not a mystery. And to me, that was the big freight train that hit me right in the head, with this election. And I'm just curious, as a political science, is this less about the leaders and more about the population?
Well, it's interesting. I think corruption is absolutely hugely important in terms of, and shocking. I mean, well, on a number of levels. First, the scale is undeniably just far larger than anything we've seen.
Right.
I mean, before. I mean, you really have to go to to find parallels. You have to go to these far out examples. Dominican Republic under Trujillo in the 50s. I mean, these are weird examples that I raise in my comparative politics course of these crazy dictators who steal their entire country, or Mobutu and Zaire. I mean, those were worst cases.
And right, or Maharajas and
right, but that's that you really have to think hard to find. But in terms of anything, any of us are kind of have any exposure to on a daily basis, far worse than Nixon, far worse. I mean, the Democratic Party is hardly a squeaky clean party, but this is. This really, I guess, harks back to kind of in so many ways, to the spoils era of the 19th century, with where office is considered primarily a kind of source of income, and this is very much how Trump thinks. And so the remarkable thing, and I think this is what you're driving at, is the kind of utter passivity of the population in response, which is quite shocking, because if you look globally, so many protests in recent history have been in response to corruption. In Romania, in Serbia recently, in the country I study, Ukraine, and the sort of revolution that happened there. So many of these revolutions, in Latin America, in Brazil, were in response to corruption that was far less severe and overt than what we see in the United States. And I think it's hard not to be incredibly depressed about that. But I think part of the reason, and this I think you're driving at, is that what he figured out was sort of a weakness in our kind of media ecosystem, in the sense that ultimately our media depends on signals, from those in power. And if those in power treat corruption as illegitimate, the media will, respond in kind and treat it as illegitimate. But he's figured out that for his supporters who only have Fox News, if he just says, not only am I doing corruption, but that's okay and there's no problem with it, then, they're not going to contradict him. So I think he's really exposed a dramatic, really serious vulnerability in our democracy because it's just really genuinely hard to understand why people aren't more pissed off by this kind of stuff, right? Because it's such a kind of open violation of his oath of office, of, everything.
How much of you do you think that is animated by fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, but I also think it's like, normalization.
Mm-hmm.
That people just that there's this people. It's hard to shock people these days, and that's part of the problem. Is that there's been so much in the fire hose of this kind of stuff that it's just hard to people don't get shocked anymore.
You live within the ivory towers of academia, and I'm just curious, I guess, as a political scientist, what do you feel in terms of because our public is so uninformed about the things that we're talking about how fascism and emerges, the Reconstruction, what a glorious sort of leap forward and then a terrible backlash. Just we're so ignorant about the truth of our history that it seems like what's happening now to most people is just detached from the continuum where, in my view, it's intimately connected.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. There's certainly, I think there's I forget the name of, there's, some recent good work on this that's sort of reframing American history as kind of partly a history of illiberalism. And I guess that's definitely true. At the same time, I do think it's important to acknowledge this is really a novel. There have been problems with American democracy for a very long time, especially with attacks on left wing groups but also the right wing. I mean, under John Kennedy, he really went after John Birchers using the IRS and some of the same techniques that Nixon used and that Trump is using today. So it's been definitely been a bipartisan attack. But now the difference is that under Nixon and Johnson and Kennedy and FDR and those guys, the attacks were on the sort of activists and those kind of outside of the political mainstream to an important extent. Whereas Trump is really attacking he's attacking the activists, certainly, as we see on the campuses and pro-Palestinian activists, but he's really going after those who are at the heart of the political establishment in a way that we've just never seen, literally since the 1790s, when John Adams went after Thomas Jeffersonian Republicans. I mean, this is literally since the very beginning of the Republic. We have not seen this, in well over, 250 years. I mean, sorry, 225 years. So it is. I mean, I think it is genuinely novel, and in that sense, just remarkable. This is. I guess I also don't want to sort of people to come up with the impression, oh, this is just kind of a return to normal American politics, but I think people need to be, this is really quite different from what we've had in the past.
Well, I remember when I was a kid, I had a lot of friends whose parents were survivors, and we go to parties. Hey, look, I get the numbers, and never buy a German car. I never buy German car. Never until, of course, the Mercedes price went down. Then they were all over it. And, there was this idea that it was something in the German character that allowed for the emergence of Hitler and National Socialism and all that stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, kind of innocently, that I think, well, maybe it's really just not a German problem. It's a human problem on some level, because, the idea was that it couldn't happen here. And it feels maybe it is. I hope not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think, work by Stanley Milgram and others who, had these experiments where he got, normal folks, these weren't sort of evil ideologues, to sort of inflict these massive, what they thought were deadly shocks on other innocent people. I mean, and I guess what this has shown is that human beings as such just have enormous capacity to normalize even extreme acts of violence. And it all depends on what your neighbor is doing. If everyone else is moving against the dictatorship, then you're going to move against it. But if everyone else around you tells you it's normal, most people are going to believe it and they're going to go along with it. So I absolutely agree with you. I think this is not like a German issue. This is a kind of human issue, right? And also the other thing is knows that all cultures have their good folks and their bad folks. There's no culture that's more moral than the rest of us. That's just the case. So that we're all in a sense have to watch out.
Being raised in the United States with all the movies about fighting for freedom, and probably grew up watching all the documentaries and all the movies about defeating Nazism, usually at the point of a rifle.
Yeah.
Usually these victories for freedom were won on battlefields. I don't know how true that is, but it's part of our mythology. My point is, even on speaking to my father yesterday, said, well, democracy is going to survive. It's going to be okay. But I'm not so sure.
No, I don't think we can, there's nothing inherent in America that makes democracy going to survive. You have to fight. That's the thing. I mean, in one sense, I'm optimistic. I think that what is true is that in the United States, in contrast to countries like Hungary or Russia, capitalist development has, spread resources across society. So, even with inequality, there's a very robust middle class. It's going to be very hard for Trump to halt the contributions to the Democratic Party, and he's going to try his best. But I don't think he's going to probably succeed. It's important to sort of avoid the kind of fatalism that sometimes comes with this. I mean, we've transitioned to authoritarianism. We can never go back. And that's definitely not the case. Can go back, but, we have to do it. We can't just, it's not just going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have to take advantage of the resources we have.
So, I was in a workshop. I've written screenplays. One of the scripts I wrote is called Satyagraha in America, A True Love Story. And it's about the sit-in kids and their mentor, James Lawson, who you might know about. But he was really a brilliant theorist, but also a minister. He helped train Martin Luther King in sort of the discipline of Gandhi and nonviolence. He just passed away a year ago. And I just finished that Jonathan Ive book about Martin Luther King. He's my next guest. And I'm kind of, like, what's a strategy? What's realistic going forward? I feel like even what we're doing now, I'm way below the threshold of corporate media here in my apartment, is something. So what is to be done? It's almost like, wasn't that a Lenin question or something like that?
So I think, on this point, Sarah McBride, she's the trans congressperson, and she had a great quote that I saw. I don't remember where I saw it, but, basically, if all of us have a little courage, you don't need heroes, which basically means if all of us do just a small amount, then you don't have to rely on heroes, even like Martin Luther King, as much, that sort of and I think that's part of the issues that we shouldn't be waiting around for someone to do something, and so all of us have a role to play. And what do we do? There's like a million things, right? One, support fact-based media. Pay for that subscription.
Yeah, I got the Washington Post. I got the New York Times. People have issues with some of these papers, and the LA Times, which is like this, in my view.
You may disagree with some of their editorial policies, or the New York Times headlines are sometimes insane. Having just published there, they these weird algorithms that determine, because they're basically trying to get more hits.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they come up, and people will complain about these headlines. But the much more important than the headline is the fact that you can be positive that what you read in the paper is actually true, and they spend a tremendous amount of effort and time to do this. And without fact-based media, you cannot have democracy. And so that's something everybody can do. You can pay for a subscription. You can also contribute to the Democratic Party and anti-Trump causes. And I mean, one of the terrifying things about what's been going on recently is that donors at this critical moment are scared. And so many have withheld donations to NGOs, precisely at a moment where we desperately need them. But we're a rich society. We can all do a part to sort of keep these organizations alive, right? Show up at town halls. If you're limited Democratic district, encourage your Democratic congressperson to do the right thing. If they're doing the right thing, make sure they know that you appreciate that, right? If it's a Republican district, then go show up and show that you're pissed off. Show up at Tesla dealerships. Do not firebomb them, please. Yeah. That really does not help.
Yeah.
And I think it's important, I think this hasn't been an issue, but violence really is deeply counterproductive. But I think there's so much we can do, and it's getting crunch time because, I mean, obviously with the 2026 election, I think there is a real question with investigations on Act Blue and others about the how free and fair the election will be. But that depends on us. This stuff doesn't work if people resist.
And one of the terms, of course, I'm a little late getting to it, but it's yourself and Steve Levitsky have, I think, introduced it to us, is competitive authoritarianism. And what's ironic to me as I was reading about it is that it's really not that competitive. It's to diminish the competitiveness in the society. That's the effort. It's almost like we're paying off the refs, but we can have an election. I just wanted to invite.
Yeah, no, I think to certain extent, you're right that competitive authoritarian regimes are basically kind of after the Cold War. There emerged these kinds of regimes that have regular elections. Opposition's allowed to operate openly, and opposition can win, but they engage in all sorts of authoritarian behavior. But the important thing is that in these regimes, and so you look at places like Russia, elections they take place, but they don't matter, right? They're never you can just basically ignore them, and what really matters is the military, and whether the military is the one institution that's capable of probably of overthrowing Putin, or the security services. But these are societies like the United States, like Hungary, like India, where elections matter. So you really need to invest time and energy in those avenues. And I do think I think that elections in the United States are highly competitive. I mean, I think, in fact, I think most of us would be pretty surprised if the Democratic Party doesn't take the House in 2026, given how razor thin the Republican majority is.
You mentioned, I know in what I could read about you, you spent some of your earlier years in Russia at a time of a tremendous change. And you just mentioned one of your major areas of interest subjects is, of course, Ukraine. And where's that going? It's just unending war, grinding two societies, one smaller than the other, into some kind of horror show. Is there an exit that's realistic?
I think it's hard to know. I do know, I think that it's hard to kind of be optimistic. I think, well, I mean, at the same time, there are a couple of things. I think drone warfare, there's been tremendous advances in drone warfare technology that has in many ways equalized these kind of contests. It seems unlikely at this point that Russia will be able to seize large amounts of territory, at least quickly. But obviously, the U.S. is by far the world's largest military, and so without U.S. support, it's very hard. I will say that it's important to recognize that this conflict, while it may seem far away, and it has enormous implications for the world we live in. I mean, some people forget, a few hundred years ago, countries were constantly at war with each other. I think in pre-modern France, 85% of years are spent at war, right? War was like part of the reality. And thanks to the post-war era, after World War II, foreign invasions stopped. And we've been able to, places like Canada, the United, to lesser extent the United States, but, places like Canada and other countries have been able to devote their resources towards economic development, which has been really nice. But, once someone like Putin gets away with taking over Ukraine, he ain't the only dictator who has designs on his neighbor. And so it's just going to open the floodgates. And, it's going to start with China and Taiwan, but, it's just going to go in a lot of unpredictable directions. So we're going to basically have to be a society that spends all of our time worrying about being invaded. And I don't think anybody wants that. I think what's going on in Ukraine, obviously affects Ukrainians most, but I think there are sort of broader global implications that I don't think are sort of sufficiently recognized.
Well, I think the people in the Ukraine are heroic. I mean, they're fighting the battles that maybe the West might be fighting, right there, in eastern Ukraine. It seems like the old Russian strategy of just pouring men and machines and grinding to death. It's like Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War. He just knew he had the numbers, and I'm going to play out the numbers, is the prevailing strategy, over there for Putin. My question is, how sustainable is that? When will the Russian kettle start to boil? Because there's a lot of things you can do to hide, but it's hard to hide coffins, when they come back into places like.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I think that's definitely, one source of hope. I mean, that, at the same time, I mean, basically Putin's strategy has very much been to take soldiers from the poorer parts of Russia, the ethnic minorities. So if you go to Moscow, or St. Petersburg, the big cities, the rich cities, Putin's main source of support, no one's been drafted. You can go there. Apparently, I mean, if I ever went there, I'd be arrested. But those populations aren't affected. So he's managed, so far at least, to kind of insulate his supporters from the war, which has allowed him to sort of endure massive casualties in ways that I think none of us really thought possible.
And so it's a racist kind of a war. So it's the ethnic minorities.
It's those are people who've been fighting because he knows that, they're politically weak, they're not organized, and, he can get away with it. So.
Right. And we were talking about China and Taiwan. And I always felt when our beloved leader started talking about Greenland and Canada and the Gulf of America, which, my joke is that he renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and the rest of the world is renamed the United States assholistan. These efforts and these wishes, to me, are an invitation to the Putins and the Chinese. Yeah, you go get yours, we'll get ours. This is the new world order. Let's just grab the loose scraps on the table.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think that, we in Canada have to, some level, take those threats seriously, but obviously I don't think an invasion is imminent, but it does have much more sort of immediate implications for Taiwan above all.
Right. It's an international signal. It's like,
exactly. So,
because if you're a diplomat, an American diplomat, and you go, hey, could you just stay the hell out of Taiwan? I don't want to hear your shit about fucking Taiwan because you guys want Canada and you're about ready to grab Greenland. You've already renamed the Gulf of Mexico. So
yeah, definitely.
That's my thought. I feel like, one of the problems for us here is that we just don't understand the truth of our history. We're so wrapped up in the mythology of it that we can't see what's going on right now. And I really appreciate what you're doing, because I do feel like there is an obligation for people that are in academia to reach out to the hoi polloi, people like me, the uninformed masses that need some perspective and truth about what's going on. And so I appreciate you being here and your scholarship and your outreach to me.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Hardly hoi polloi. Is that a bad thing? That's kind of fun. Hoi polloi.
Yeah, it's a good word. I never have used.
I definitely would like to say it a lot. So.
Yeah. So are you teaching? Is there another book or something that?
Yeah, no, I think we're going to probably Steve and I are doing a book on Trump. So.
Oh, okay. Now, when you do a book on the Putin's vice president, it's not like you need to go into, or maybe I'm curious, like to go into these archives and unlock freedom of information, because so much of it is all on display.
But it's about sort of, we're not some investigative reporters who are going to reveal secrets you didn't know. It's all out there, but I think our contribution is to kind of take the mass of information and provide some sort of order and logic to it all, and sort of help us to sort of understand what the important things are and what the implications are.
And hopefully it'll come out sooner than later, so that there's something constructive about it.
Yeah.
My take on him is he's an imbecile, but he's a predator. And like all predators, they smell blood. They have just an incredible ability to feel the weaknesses around them, and they attack. And they attack without any kind of hesitation. We saw that really on display in the first round, when in the Republican primaries, when he actually had some competition. His capacity to smell the weakness and vulnerabilities in others and just go after them like a saber-toothed cat was pretty unique and pretty remarkable for me to observe. I think the question I asked you earlier was, will his incompetence betray his agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the hope. At the same time, I guess a couple of reactions. One, he's a lot less incompetent than he was in his first term, he has all these people behind Project 2025 clearly knew what they were doing. I mean, who even knew that the president had power over the Kennedy Center? Stuff like that. These are guys who've done their homework. They clearly have correctly identified a lot of weak spots in the Constitution and laws, and so that's made a huge difference. The other issue is that because of polarization, there's a much higher floor in terms of his popularity. So even if he completely screws up, his incompetence cannot disqualify him nearly as much as it might have in another historical moment.
Right. And today or yesterday, we saw there was I didn't even know there was a federal trade court, but apparently so. And they obstructed his tariffs. Now, whether or not.
Yeah, hopefully that will hold. But again, that's the other thing is that, we don't, ultimately what's going to stop him if he just tells people to do it anyways and ignore the courts. The courts don't have an army. So, that's, I think.
Right. But alternatively, the federal government isn't everywhere. In other words, if people en masse didn't pay their taxes, there'd be very little that they could do if it was.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm going to just leave this as a conclusion. I said, I think really we need to be brave.
Yeah.
Courage counts. And also,
absolutely,
the collective matters. Right.
Yes, the collective matters. We all matter. And then, I think especially, we are, democracy, and that you shouldn't get caught up by fatalism, and that I think just everybody has a part to play in this.
Right. Well, I appreciate the part that Lucan Way is playing up there in Canada, and I'm doing my best down here. So, folks, thanks for hanging in to another installment of The Rebel Without Applause. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. See ya.